Well, I want to thank Toro and Roger for giving me the privilege of participating in such a moving event. There's so many unplanned synergies between the presentations we've heard so far, and I can only imagine that to be Charles's spirit here in the room with us. Because Professor Barrett mentioned Jerry Garcia, I'm going to take the indulgence here of sharing a personal story before I turn to my prepared remarks. My colleagues don't know this about me, but I was a consummate deadhead in college. And I was a voracious Jerryologist. I read just about everything that was out there about the life and music of Jerry Garcia. And so for me, the first piece by Charles Reich that I read was not The New Property. It was not The Greening of America. It was an interview with Jerry Garcia that appeared in the 100th issue of Rolling Stone magazine back in 1972. Years later, I had the great honor of meeting Charles in person at a dinner that Michael Verrett hosted. And I came to learn that there were hours and hours of tapes with Jerry in conversation with Charles that were not transcribed and not part of the publications that had ensued. And so it became sort of a kind of obsession, a life quest of mine, to have those tapes see the light of day. I mean, just for the sake of human civilization, they need to see the light of day. And unless the family might reveal that they know where those tapes are, I've kind of resigned myself to Judith's beautiful description of Charles's 46th mountain this morning. Those tapes for me are the 46th mountain. I'll just spend my life imagining them. Let's sit together at lunch. So, as you all know, Charles Reich never stopped worrying for the world. Throughout his life, he diagnosed our social and environmental ills with unmatched prescience, insight, and clarity. Yet he also never stopped believing that our better selves could still prevail. Even as the zeitgeist turned decidedly against the new consciousness that he once thought to be inevitable, he never wavered in his conviction that true freedom must and can come from human individuals working together. In these brief remarks, I want to start by reading some passages from one of his first published works, a book review entitled The Promised Land of Science, that appeared in the Yale Law Journal in 1962. And I'll conclude by describing two of Reich's final unfinished works, those manuscript proposals that Professor Barrett mentioned. And in between, I'll tell you a story about a newt. The 1962 book review is characteristic of all of Reich's writing. It is expansive in vision, unabashed in its embrace of values, and shot through with a voice that seems, at times, outside of time. The book that he's reviewing was a book called Toward a Reasonable Society, The Values of Industrial Civilization. It was written by the prominent industrial economist Clarence Edwin Ayres. According to the Yale Law Journal headnote, the book had a jacket price of $4.75. In the book, Ayres attempts to offer a moral defense of industrial technological society, which in the post-war era is seen to be displacing traditional sources of social value like religion. Reich begins his review by bleakly assessing the state of America's well-being, despite the materialist boom that's going on all around him. Reich writes, "Apathy and lack of purpose deeply trouble mid-century Americans. Life constantly gets better, but seemingly ever less satisfying. Today's youth, despairing of finding meaningful careers, talk of seeking in marriage, in leisure activities, and in their personal lives a sense of purpose which society does not provide. In the glittering world that science has built, they have somehow lost the way." Now, this is almost a decade before the greening of America, but his ability to perceive and diagnose our cultural malaise is already on full display. And the contrast between Reich's prophetic diagnosis and Ayres's prescription could not be sharper. Ayres wants to lionize the techno-industrialist structures that Reich is beginning to recognize as the source of our problems rather than the remedy. Reich describes Ayres's view as follows. "The major values of industrial civilization," Mr. Ayres says, "are those things that demonstrably contribute most to human life: freedom, equality, security, abundance, and excellence. Mr. Ayres believes that industrial civilization makes possible the highest realization of these true universal values. Such a civilization provides the greatest freedom in choosing one's work, in deciding what to buy, in movement, communication, and opportunity for intellectual development. Such a society, he says, offers both abundance and excellence. It promises the best life that man has ever known. Now, Ayers is a New Deal thinker who believes that the science of economics can be used by government planners to promote social well-being. But the perceived sources of social well-being that he relies on are no different than those embraced by today's neoliberal heirs to heirs, who argue that social well-being is maximized by markets free of government interference. In both cases, the conception of value is one biased toward only that which is legible and measurable by the welfare economic framework. Reich writes critically of this view. Mr. Ayers offers abundance and the progressive multiplication of all good things, and he describes the ultimate good as bringing home the bacon. But if this is indeed what life is all about, why do some of his guests look green and sated? Is it possible that the feast promised by industrial civilization, a feast of goods, of travel, of art, of intellectual development, of leisure, can yet leave an aching emptiness within? Is it conceivable that this universal goal of mankind is not the way to contentment? Reich concludes the book review by warning against the loss of meaning that would follow if we yielded over our worldviews and our institutions to the science of welfare economics. He writes, "Science knows least of all about the sources of human happiness. Because of this, science should be the first to warn against the uncritical drive toward a scientific civilization, a society with values based wholly on what is scientifically known or knowable. Do we really want an abundance of everything, or is the search better than the finding? Do we really want to possess knowledge, or would it be better for men always to follow it like a sinking star? Do we really want a reasonable society if, as it seems, we must forego all that has the power to touch drab life with magic, a magic which reason can never know?" So next, I want to share with you a story about magic which reason can never know. 2 years ago, I had the good fortune to be hiking with my daughter in Vermont when we stumbled upon a small pond that was teeming with juvenile red-spotted newts. I grew up in a rural wooded area in southern Indiana and spent most of my free time as a child outdoors. And my engagement with the more than human world was routine. And there seemed at that time to be so much of the more than human world. Animals were everywhere during my childhood. Now, when I stumble upon a pond filled with newly born amphibians, it feels like an event worth noting, worth sharing. My daughter, who my partner and I have given her an internet alias to protect her privacy as the world grows. So her internet alias is Sunny. And because we're going to be posted one day, I'll call her Sunny in these remarks. My daughter had never seen newts in her lifetime, so we devoted that afternoon to communing with them. I carefully scooped up one of the young newts in my cupped hands, and I let Sunny hold it. She was 4 years old at the time. She's not a calm child. She's more of the hyperkinetic, hyper-talkative sort. Professor Tani's met her. But with this filmy alien in her hand, she was transformed. She became utterly entranced, perfectly still, unreservedly present. After a few minutes in the thrall of the tiny creature, Sunny whispered to me, "I bet she thinks I'm a giant." And then after a pause, she added, "I hope she knows I'm a gentle giant." And what I loved about that moment is that it showed my daughter's grasp of some important truths that are undeniable about the human-nature relation. Like scientists, lawyers tend to define truth as that which cannot be doubted, but there are other ways of knowing, including knowing that which cannot be denied. One thing Sunny appeared to accept as an undeniable truth in that moment was that the non-human animal in her hand was a subject with a perspective on the world that deserves consideration. Sunny called the newt she, not in an anthropomorphizing way, but simply because Sunny hasn't yet learned to depersonify her fellow creatures as it, or property. She speculated on what the newt was thinking not in an effort to elevate its standing in a ladder of life, but simply because she hasn't yet learned to confine the label thinking to the eccentricities of human consciousness. At the same time, Sunny also seemed to sense the unbridgeable gap between her and this other mind. Sunny said, "I hope she knows," recognizing that any mutual understanding between her and the newt must rest on faith and belief as much as reason and evidence. Importantly, though, Sunny did not shy away from this yawning chasm. Quite the contrary, she seemed to relish the opportunity to commune with animate mystery. And it was a communion. Despite knowing she could not know what the newt knows, Sunny still described herself as being in relation with this other. The relationship had two notable features. First, Sunny saw that she is, in her words, the giant. Even at 4 years old, she seemed to sense the awful power of Homo sapiens. But Sunny also imbued the relation with ethical dimensions that exceed power. She constituted herself in relation to the newt as a gentle giant. Now, as a fact witness here, I can attest that Sunny was incredibly gentle with this 1-ounce wonder of life coiled in her hand. In that little moment, she seemed to demonstrate Emmanuel Levinas's truth that we do not arrive in the world as subjects first. We are instead called into being by others to whom we are infinitely ethically obliged. We are individuated through our relations to others, and in particular to those others who are absolutely vulnerable to our existence. In Levinas's philosophy, "Do not kill me" is the wordless utterance issued by an inscrutable other that first calls us into being. I hope I don't sound grandiose if I tell you that I believe my daughter heard the newt compel her, "Do not kill me." Now, Sunny never had the chance to meet Charles Reich, but she will meet him through his writings. She is a child of the Anthropocene, just as he was a child of the Great Depression. In that sense, Reich's life was bookended by calamities so great they call into question all our ways of perceiving and pursuing human flourishing. And Reich's frequent calls to imbue law with more magic and more imagination could not be more timely. We are in the midst of the 6th great extinction event in the history of our planet. We are well on our way to fashioning a climate that is inconsistent and incompatible with social, stable existence. It would seem unlikely if the worldviews and institutions that gave rise to this crisis will also be the ones that solve it. Even the term Anthropocene reflects a glaring lack of imagination. As the climate justice scholar Maxine Burkett notes, the term seems to suggest that our current predicament arose as the inevitable consequence of something fundamental about and common to humanity. But that narrative is false. Climate change and other ecological ills plaguing us today arose from a very distinctive subform of human, one that spread from Europe and brought about a relation to the Earth qualitatively different from anything precedent in our existence as a species. The challenge facing us today is this: how can we surpass the Enlightenment dogmas that enabled, in roughly 3 centuries, a mode and scale of human existence that threatens the survivability of all life on Earth? Individualism, rationalism, reductionism, liberalism, secularism, materialism, capitalism, this spasm of isms that erupted in just the blink of an evolutionary eye, but has provided the operating code for the 6th great extinction event on the planet. How can we salvage what is good and worthy in those Enlightenment isms while abandoning the hubris, the imperialism, the human exceptionalism, the tendency to dominate and destroy in the name of progress? I pose these questions precisely because they're ones that I find Charles Reich grappling with throughout his career, and indeed late into his life. By a letter dated September 12, 2008, Reich shared with me 2 book proposals that, in his words, address the same underlying problem in very different ways. With permission from Reich's family, the Yale Law Journal will be publishing these 2 brief writings as part of an online symposium celebrating his life and work later this spring. In one proposal, Reich lays out a vision of what he had called in an earlier article, the individual sector, a space apart from the public and private sectors within which massive machines of governmental and corporate power have come to dominate the terms of human existence. Careful readers of Reich's work will recognize his distinctive brand of left libertarianism in this proposal. But the call for individual freedom feels more urgent now and informed by intervening decades of political fracture, mounting inequality, market creep, and the rise of existential environmental threats. Reich locates declining human vitality and the rise of America's red-blue split in what he calls our unrecognized loss of human habitat. Without a sanctuary home and habitat where human beings can flourish, individuals have turned on each other rather than on the machines that have wedged them in with ever-tightening force. The private sector that nominally belongs to individuals instead is controlled by, quote, giant non-human entities that increasingly enjoy totalitarian power superimposed upon our earlier form of constitutional government. In my daughter's terms, these are not gentle giants. Critically, Reich draws direct connection between the environmental crisis and the human habitat crisis. In the plain and charismatic prose that marks all of his work, Reich writes, "Human beings have created power so immense that it has escaped the rule of law, and lawless power must inevitably become destructive power. It has turned against nature, and now it has turned against us, its creators." The response Reich offers to this grave moment of irresponsible power is revolutionary. He proposes institution of a constitutionally protected individual sector, a third pillar of our political economy in which individuals could be guarded against the oppressive footprint of organizational power, whether government or corporate. The second book proposal, entitled The Rise of Lawless Power, carries this theme further. Reich examines human power and its contemporary amplification through technologies such as weapons of mass destruction, the corporate form, and mass media. He fears the unchecked power of what he calls the mega-humans of today, who command governments, corporations, and private armies. Although written nearly a decade before we learned how deliberately oligarchic powers have weaponized corporate-owned social media to undermine democratic processes, The Rise of Lawless Power has much to say to us today. In response to the rise of lawless power, Reich returns to one of his lifelong themes. He writes, "We must begin to see that no one is left to save us but ourselves, acting as individual human beings. Although we may experience a foreboding sense that the machines have taken over and they will carry us straight to catastrophe, we must also remember that we have created these destructive forces and we alone can change their course." I believe the recent resurgence of mass protests and civil disobedience, other forms of activism in the face of the climate crisis, may mark an awakening of the sort Reich longed to witness. Features of the climate movement, such as Extinction Rebellion, the Valve Turners, Fridays for the Future, Youth v. Gov, seem perfectly matched to Reich's description of the true significance of 1960s era activism. In his words, every instance of that 1960s activism, from the most playful to the most serious, had this in common: it was a response. They were all a response to an urgent sense that things were out of control and that no one was minding the store, least of all those in positions of responsibility. Although shared by Reich in 2008, these two book proposals carry an eerie resonance in 2020. We desperately need the books that he proposed but was unable to complete. To an environmental law scholar like myself, what marks the two proposals as especially profound and necessary is that he revives political economy by placing ideas about nature at the heart of his analysis. Environmental law is a fruitful place to engage in political theory, precisely because the field of environmental law haunts our vision of liberal harmony and plenitude in just the right way. Environmental law poses the limit cases, the stress tests that liberalism must endure in order to be durable. Climate change has made these questions literally unavoidable, so the significance of Reich's writings will only increase with the temperature. So it falls to us now to take up his unfinished work and to continue, as he did, showing up with hope. We must do so again, as Reich did, even when the path to equitable and sustainable human flourishing seems hopeless to all but ourselves alone. Thank you.